This always creates a little confusion in me because, you know, the word kahuna is a very specific term which implies mastery, especially self-mastery. And in Polynesia, which you're about to become very familiar with, if you're going to move out here, in Polynesia, there were different kinds of kahuna according to the expertise that each one of them employed. For example, you would have kahunas who were specialized in canoe building, or kahunas who were specialized in geomancy, or kahunas who were navigators who could read the stars. Then you had the mystics, those who could see between the veils, see between the worlds, and bring back knowledge from the other side. This is the kind of kahuna who I fell into relationship with back in 1996. And he was a very extraordinary man because he was the descendant of King Kamehameha on his mother's side, 7 generations. And on his father's side, he was the descendant of a very famous high chief who was the one Kamehameha killed to become the king. These two men were actually cousins. And so he had an exceptional genealogy. His name was Halemakua. And, you know, I've mentioned him before on previous coast-to-coast shows because of the extraordinary direction that my life took once he came into it. He was actually drawn toward me because he read my first book, Spirit Walker. Now, you know, just a very brief recap for those of your listeners who haven't read it. Spirit Walker is the story, as I said, of how I went crazy in Hawaii. I began to have these visions, these spontaneous visionary experiences. This was back in 1986 when my kids were still very small. And in these visions, I would find myself becoming completely paralyzed, physically unable to move, while my physical body was enhanced by these enormous feelings of power or force, or what some people have called ecstasy, the spiritual ecstasy. And it was in these states, which would sometimes last for a few moments, sometimes for a few hours, that my conscious awareness was drawn into connection with the mind of another man. Now, when I say that, you know, there's still a side of me, Hank Wesselman, the scientist, that steps back and says, geez, Hank, did you really say that to these people? Because it sounds so incredibly flaky. And in fact, until I had these experiences myself, I would have written the whole thing off to wishful thinking. But in these episodes, I would find myself in somebody else's body. And if that wasn't bad enough, this guy, I would soon determine through being able to pick up on his memories, on his thoughts, on his emotions.
Did he know this was happening? Did he know this was happening, Hank?
I had no idea what was happening to me. I thought they were extraordinarily vivid dreams. But when they began to occur in sequence, with one dream leading into the next, which led into the next, which led into the next, I began to realize that I'd stumbled into something absolutely extraordinary. And that's what the Spirit Walker story is really about. It's about how I was drawn into the shaman's world of mystery and magic. And the interesting thing, George, I wasn't seeking this. You know, I'm not one of these guys who studied at the knees of the wisdom masters, hoping for visions and transcendent experiences, practicing meditation and yoga. You know, I worshipped solely at the altar of science when all this was going on. And so, you know, when this began to happen, it was kind of like I was wandering around shell-shocked a good deal at the time, trying to figure out if I was going crazy or not.
Oh, I would guess so. And I assume no one was able to help you.
Well, you know, I didn't have any honored spiritual elder to turn toward. You know, in a tribal society, these kinds of experiences are expected. They're normal under certain circumstances. But we don't live in a society in which experience with visions and spirits is part of our organized reality on a day-to-day basis. I mean, you know, most people who are having experiences like that would go to great lengths to conceal them, to not reveal them. But when I began to connect with this man who lives in the future, he was in the process of going on a quest of geographic investigation into the interior of the lost continent of America. This guy is a man of Hawaiian ancestry, but he's not living in Hawaii. He's living somewhere in North America on the West Coast in a landscape which is profoundly different from the landscape of, let's say, California or Oregon of today.
Right.
It looks a lot more like Costa Rica or the Amazon, and it sort of brought into the foreground all of my concerns about greenhouse warming and massive biome shifts with, whole climatic regions migrating toward the north as the climate of the whole planet warms. And, without sounding, like I'm going into the profit business, one of the things that concerns me greatly is that the Spirit Walker story was written 15 years ago. And every single one of the prophecies, every single one of the predictions that I perceived and which are published in that book, every single one of them has manifested, and just as fast as I said it would.
Are they primarily earth changes, those prophecies?
Climate changes,
yeah,
I would say, and sea level rise. If what I've perceived is valid, and I believe it is, the whole Central Valley of California is filled with water, kind of like Puget Sound, and it's surrounded by rainforest, really big rainforest. So this man, whose name is Nainoa, lives on the western side of what he calls the inland sea, in a community which is descended from Hawaiian voyagers.
Hold on right there, Hank. We're going to take this quick break, and we'll come right back. We're with Hank Lusselman. Hank, we were talking about some of the prophecies of your earlier works, and the break got us. Let's go back and review a little bit and then move onward to talk about the Bowl of Light.
Well, I brought this story up once again because this is what drew me and the Kahuna together. This story is really the story of my connection with a man who lives in the future. And I would discover, largely through having repetitive connections with this guy, that this guy appears to be one of my descendants. To be precise, he's probably one of my descendant selves. And this, through this whole dreamlike, visionary experience, into a completely new frame of reference for me. If he was the descendant and I was the ancestor, it was like an ancestor-descendant relationship. And this is what the Kahuna knew a great deal about. He was very much involved with his ancestors. So in 1996, I was invited to speak at an institute here on the Big Island of Hawaii. And on the day that I went to talk, I was a little bit nervous about it because about 50 people showed up to hear what I had to say about the transformational community and visions, and they had read Spirit Walker, and they all wanted to have a look at me to see what I was like. And I was just about to begin my talk, and the door opened, and in walked this big Hawaiian man who was about half a head taller than I am. Now, I'm 6'1", which means he was about 6'4" or 5". And he outweighed me easily by 100 pounds or more. He had a big white ponytail down his back and a great big bushy beard down his chest. He was wearing a flashy aloha shirt, and he was carrying this absolutely magnificently carved walking stick. Now, my hosts introduced me to this man, Hale Makua, and I'd heard about this guy for years. He was the Kahuna Nui. He was, because of his genealogy, because of his ancestors, everybody knew him. He was, when he got off the plane in Tahiti or New Zealand or Easter Island, Rapa Nui, he'd be mobbed at the airport by people who wanted to touch him, who wanted to talk to him, who wanted to take him home and feed him.
He was a holy man, wasn't he?
He was very, very well known. And so, in some ways, he was kind of like the Dalai Lama of Polynesia. Now, here in Hawaii, he kept a very low profile because he was a very humble man. And so in Hawaii, there weren't that many people who actually knew who Makua was. And I call him Makua because that's what people generally called him. But I'd heard about him for years. Now, he was the real thing. And you just don't pick up the phone and, find him in the phone book, because in those days he didn't talk on the phone. He was, a spiritual elder.
Right.
And so he'd come in because a friend of mine had sent him my book. And he wanted to have a look at me, I think, to see if I was real. And so he came and was very gracious, and he gave me a beautiful lei, and he put a lei around my wife's neck as well. And then he listened to the talk that I gave for about an hour and a half to this people who'd come to hear what I had to say. And those times I was talking about the transformational community. I was very interested about us, and that includes all the people in your coast-to-coast community, people who were involved in, the ending of this cycle and the beginning of the next, and people who have essentially woken up. So I talked about the beliefs and values and trends that we all hold dear in a kind of an academic way, I suppose. And at the end, I got this sort of nagging feeling that there was something that this man Makua wanted to say. So I turned to him and I said, Elder Makua, I don't know what the correct protocol is, but I'm getting this feeling that there's something that you've come to say, and would it be correct for me to ask you to speak? Well, this was a man, I would learn, who traveled in the company of his ancestral spirits. He had a whole cluster of ancestors who were constantly following him around, advising him, talking to him, and so forth and so on. So, he looked at me, and then he sort of leaned to his left as though somebody was talking in his left ear. Then he kind of leaned to the right as though somebody was talking in his right ear. And then he smiled at me and stood up. Now, he looked at me across the room, and he said, a friend of mine sent me your book, Spirit Walker, and I read it. Silence in the room. I mean, you could have heard a pin drop. This was like high noon in Polynesia. This was the moment of truth. He said, I read your book again just to make sure I got it right. And then I went down to the beach, and I took your book and put it down on the sand, and I called in the ancestors, and we had a talk about you. Silence in the room.
And you're waiting. Oh, no, here it comes, right?
Well, I was preparing myself to be condemned because, as you know, indigenous people don't like it when outsiders trespass into their spiritual traditions.
No, not at all.
And the Spirit Walker books have a lot of kahuna knowledge in them. So, I was waiting, and he looked at me and said, the ancestors asked me what your name is. And so I told them, your name is Wesselman, Hank Wesselman. And he smiled. And he said, ancestors told me I wasn't pronouncing your name right. They said,